Good evening. Tonight's program of Tuesday Night Learning is dedicated to the memory of Bert Gilman, who recently passed away. Bert had been looking forward to introducing his longtime dear friend Allan Nadler this evening. In fact, he'd been looking forward to it for a very long time, because this evening's talk on A.M. Klein had initially been scheduled for spring 2020. It is appropriate that tonight be in honor of Bert, a gentle, soft-spoken Renaissance man par excellence. Bert was a thinker, un grand homme. He chaired adult ed at the Shar over 30 years ago, yet all the years since he remained wise counsel in residence. At his funeral, Rabbi Shire commented that Bert frequently gave the final word at Shar events. I may add that he invariably did so with élan, wit, and charm. Bert did the Shar proud. When Bert's health forced him to relinquish tennis, he turned to poetry. How fitting that this evening, devoted to the genius of the poet A.M. Klein, be in honor of our beloved Bert Gilman. I now call upon a past president of Shar Shamayim, Jonathan Schneiderman, to introduce our speaker.
Rabbi Allan Nadler is not a speaker who requires an introduction. He is well known to most of us, having served as rabbi of the congregation from 1984 to 1992. He is a highly regarded speaker on the circuit. He is erudite, brilliant, and also known to be fairly forthright with his opinions. Following his years at Shar HaShamayim, Rabbi Nadler served as the director of research at the YIVO Institute in New York, prior to becoming director of Jewish Studies at Drew University. Rabbi Nadler retired to Montreal a few years ago and had to decide between taking up residence in the neighborhood of his birth and youth, Outremont, or Westmount. He settled on an apartment near Shar Shamayim, just down the street, so that he could be part of the community and congregation which he loves in his own very special way. This evening, however, is a journey back to Rabbi Nadler's old stomping grounds of the Main and Montreal's historic Jewish neighborhood of the Golden Age. A.M. Klein was probably the most Jewishly literate author in the history of Anglo-Jewish literature. He translated from both Hebrew and Yiddish literature. He was the editor of the daily Canada Adler and the author of thousands of essays, reviews, and editorials written for the Canadian Jewish Chronicle. Klein was also known to be a close friend of David Lewis, the first Jewish leader of a federal political party in Canada, the NDP. And therein lies the second connection with our guest speaker tonight. Professor Nadler and A.M. Klein's commitment to democratic socialism, not to mention their deep love of everything Montreal, Quebec, and French culture. The rocking chair will be the focus of Professor Nadler's lecture this evening. Professor Nadler has agreed to take a few questions after his presentation, and I would ask you to submit your questions on the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. For the many of us who know Allan Nadler, we know what to expect. For the rest of you, fasten your seatbelts. Rabbi Nadler.
Jonathan, thank you so much for agreeing to introduce me. I just want to echo your sentiments. I was going to say a few words about Bert Gilman, but there's too much to say. He was a remarkable man, completely devoted to a constant life of learning and discovery, passionate about issues of all kinds, from Jewish education at the Shar to his commitment to environmental justice, and so many other things. He was actually one of the first people who befriended me when I first arrived at the Shar many, many decades ago in the early 1980s, when he became the chairman of the Adult Education Committee in 1984, I believe. And he was one of those people who always would hang around at the Kiddush to argue with me about my sermon, which I loved. Back in those days, as Jonathan will attest, there was nothing else to stay for. There was no food. There were those sandwiches without the crust. And so everything has changed. But so there was a small crowd, and Bert was at the center of it, where we really had lively and wonderful discourse every midday Shabbat b'Shabbatot, every Shabbos. So I want to thank Jonathan for filling in this sad instance of the huge loss of Bert Gilman, Zichrono Livracha. Jonathan has been a friend of mine for a long time, but I have to say, since I moved back to Montreal, I've grown closer and closer with him. He's proved himself to be a good man and a really good friend. Okay, Abraham Moses Klein has been dubbed, as Jonathan alluded to, the very first fully Canadian, fully Hebrew, fully French, and fully English language poet and novelist. It was Ludwig Lewisohn, the famous novelist, who said that. He was all but a native son of Canada, having arrived as a 1-year-old from the shtetl of Ratno, Ukraine. So he was unlike many of his first peers in Montreal, in Montreal's Jewish literary scene, namely the dozens of Yiddish writers and poets and authors whom he befriended, whose works he reviewed. Klein was an integral part of both first the Yiddish literary community, and he was part of that community at the age of 17 and 18. He was a fast riser, and then as soon as he arrived at McGill, when he was in his early 20s, he was already publishing poetry in a variety of journals, the Menorah Journal, the Distinguished Journal in Chicago Poetry, that's published by the Poetry Foundation of America, and many others. So by the time he was 24, he had published more than 24 poems. Klein's first language was Yiddish. That was the language of his home. And while he both translated and reviewed so many Yiddish books by writers from all over the world, but most especially Montreal Yiddish writers, the translation and commentary on the Mishnah by Simcha Petrushka, published here in Montreal, the works of Melech Ravitch, one of the greatest lyrical Yiddish poets and authors, and very prolific, and Yehuda Elberg, and so many others, too many to mention. Klein also translated the works of the most important Yiddish writers in North America. I'm not going to name them all, but Leivik and Leib Halpern and Yaakov Gladstein. I mean, he was the first person to translate the works of these towering Yiddish writers into English, and there have been very few translations since. So he was a half century ahead of the current generation, or the older, my generation of people who've become involved in Yiddish studies as an academic area of interest. Most impressively, Klein was the first English translator of one of the greatest modern Hebrew poet, the bard of Zionism and of the Yishuv, the new Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael, Chaim Nachman Bialik. To translate Bialik is extremely difficult. Very few Israelis, even highly educated Israelis, would be able to translate Bialik's Hebrew because it is so complex. It includes so many biblicisms and Talmudisms and Aramaicisms and Bialik's own invented terms. There's actually a lexicon which I have on my shelves called Milon Bialik, a dictionary of Bialik, the language of Bialik. Somehow Klein, with very little formal Jewish education, there were no Jewish day schools, no Jewish, not really afternoon schools. He studied in Cheder with a Melamed, and there was a place called the Yeshiva of Montreal that my father also attended around the same time. That was basically 2 days a week for 2 hours. Now, how Klein was able to master Yiddish and Hebrew, literary Yiddish, speaking Yiddish at home is one thing, but literary Yiddish, and to a point where he was translating very difficult, very intricate and arcane Hebrew and Yiddish poems, not only by Bialik, but by more than 25 of the poets of the new Yishuv in pre-state Eretz Yisrael, pre-Medinat Yisrael. And so he was really remarkable in that sense, a polyglot. And added to that, there was his mastery of French. Klein was educated in English literature at McGill University, but he went on to study law at the Université de Montréal. And so he was completely at home in Canadien, as it used to be called, Canadien French, or franglais, as it's now known. That term didn't exist in his day, nor did the term Québécois, as we'll see. Klein's life and work have been well documented. They don't need to be repeated here beyond some essential relevant contours. And I think a good beginning is to quote the words of the great writer and literary critic Leon Edel. Leon Edel, of course, the Pulitzer Prize winning author of the 5-volume biography of Henry James, a staggeringly brilliant literary critic, attended McGill University at the same time as Klein. He was born in Saskatchewan. Many years later, he received an honorary doctorate from the University of Saskatchewan, along with 9 other honorary doctorates. So Leon Edel was a genius. And he was nice enough to write an introduction for this book, like One Who Dreamed, a portrait of A.M. Klein by Usher Kaplan. It's a wonderful book. For lay people, if you have to read one book about Klein, this is the book you want to read. There are more scholarly books by Zelig Pollack and M.W. Steinberg, but those are really for literary scholars. Okay, so here it's just a segment of what Leon Edel wrote in his gorgeous foreword, very personal and loving foreword to this volume about his friend Klein, which ends very sadly, in which he describes the last time he saw Klein in 1957, after Klein had decided to silence himself. He retreated from poetry, from politics, from all of his commitments. But here's Edel describing Klein at the height of all of his commitments. Quote, Klein conducted his own personal 5-ring circus that combined prose and poetry writing. The law, a career as a journalist and newspaper editor. He was the editor of the Canadian Chronicle as well. Political, and he wrote over 1,000 editorials for that newspaper, really weekly. So a journalist, an editor, a political activist with the CCF and then with the NDP, a speechwriter for a corporation president and chairman of the Canadian Jewish Congress. Well, we know who that is. That's Sam Bronfman, who was Klein's personal speechwriter for several decades. We won't comment on the effect that had on Klein. As such, he was caught up in the burdens of more, I'm continuing to quote now from Edel. As such, he was caught up in the burdens of more conflicts than any human should ever have to suffer. And yet, in his struggle, bearing the burden of self-assertion and livelihood and a career in the public and as an educator at McGill, professor at McGill in the English department, Klein had an amazing capacity for astonishing love, wonderful humor, a capacity, despite all of the burdens on his shoulders, to remain open and loving, even while far from free from the splendors of the world, and especially the splendor of the word, the splendors of the world and the splendor of the word. So he was not an ivory tower kind of scholar or author. He was involved on every level in Jewish life, in communal life, in Canadian and Quebec political life. Klein is the subject of 3 biographies, as well as an ingenious, not quite a biography, but a kind of poetic history, a biography that follows his poems by Zelig Pollack. It's called The Story of the Poet, A.M. Klein, and it's not easy. It's really written for a scholarly audience, but it's an absolutely brilliant book, and it's helped me enormously in my own late life discovery and subsequent passion for Klein's works. His earliest literary influences, after the circle of Yiddish authors and poets and Yiddish socialists with whom he was involved, at the Y on Park Avenue in the old days, on St. Lawrence Boulevard and Park Avenue, and Bernard Boulevard, and the same area where I grew up. But his earliest English poetic influences was an amazing group of Anglo-Canadian poets who thrived in Montreal, specifically at McGill in the 1930s. They were known as the McGill Group, and they had wide acclaim all across North America. They included people like Louis Duduk and Sutherland and M.W. Scott and many others. In his earliest published poems, Klein shows the influence of these modernist poems. And when I say poets, his colleagues, his friends at McGill, these were undergraduates and graduate students at McGill, each one brilliant in his own right. I mean, Montreal was something in those days. It was after New York, one of the major intellectual centers, and of course, one of the major Yiddish and Jewish centers in all of North America. But Klein, very early on, already in the mid-1930s and increasingly in 1940s, turned away from modernism because of his passion for the Jewish people. Like his poetic alter ego, Bialik, whom he translated, but who also he modeled himself after Bialik as a national poet, as a leader, as not just a poet, but someone who's leading the Jewish community. For Bialik, it was the Yishuv in Israel. For Klein, it was Montreal Jewry, very specifically, the Jews of Montreal and of Quebec. He had to abandon the modernism, which focuses on the self, for a more prophetic, poetic calling that he felt. It is no accident that the most important one of the 14 poems of Bialik that Klein translated is Be'ir HaHarega, this long and gruesome and angry and devastating ballad by Bialik after he visited Kishinev in the wake of the 1903 pogrom. And that was a poem that had a huge impact on increasing the support of Zionism throughout the Russian Pale of Settlement. That had a huge impact. That was the first poem that of Bialik's that he chose. And there's a reason for that. Klein was anguished, deeply anguished by the pogroms from which his parents fled at the very beginning of the 20th century. And then subsequent series of pogroms, 1905, 1908, 1919, 1920, the worst of the pogroms, the Plura, the Ukrainian army's pogroms, in which there was, armed soldiers killing Jews, not just pogromchiks and peasants, Russian peasants. And so he became enraptured with this mission to argue against racism and anti-Semitism and to become a spokesman for the Jew in his editorials and speeches, of course, but even more so in his poetry. His first published volumes of poetry were called Half Nodded Jew in 1940, from the Shylock thing. And I'm not going to get into. I'm going to try to stick in the coming let's say 25 minutes or whatever time I have to the rocking chair. But I have to mention Half Nodded Jew, that was published by Berman Brothers, and then the Hitler Riot, which was a satirical but very angry satirical take on Hitler and Nazism in verse. And then finally, which was published by the Jewish Publication Society. And then, of course, his third most important volume of poetry, The Rocking Chair, which is about Quebec, and comes after Klein was exhausted from the sorrows of the Jews and the sorrows the Jews of Montreal gave him. He never achieved the recognition, even a fraction of the recognition he deserved. He could have easily. He was offered by the American Jew. He was approached by the American Jewish Committee that was beginning a new publication called Commentary Magazine, and the first person the board of the American Jewish Committee turned to suggest that he might be interested in it was A.M. Klein in Montreal. He was much better known in the United States because he was publishing in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in New York, and ultimately The Rocking Chair, as well as his magnificent Zionist novel, his biblical style novel, Second Scroll, probably his most famous work. Both of those were published by the very distinguished publishing house Knopf in New York City. And yet he insisted on staying in Montreal. And despite that, the acclaim that he so richly deserved, and this, I feel passionately when I read him, there's so much tragedy in his life. There's much that is wondrous about his life, certainly his writings, but there's so much that's so painful. And one of them is the lack of recognition by the Jewish community of Montreal to this day. I have to say, I went to a very fine Hebrew day school, Zionist Hebrew day school, and, I never heard of A.M. Klein. in elementary school, in high school. I took a degree in Jewish studies at McGill University as an undergraduate. Never heard of A.M. Klein, except the story my father told me about the two of us walking to shul. I was 5 years old, 4 years old, 1957. And we bumped into A.M. Klein, who was coming out of the daytime there. I think it was Shavuos, with some milk, of course, Shavuos, milchiks. And my father said, Allan, say hello to the greatest Jew in Canada. I kind of remember that my father kept reminding me about this encounter. I think it was at the corner of Curbs and Lashmore, Van Horn, or Bernard, one of those streets. And he said, my father said, say good yontif to Mr. Klein. And I said, good yontif, Mr. Klein. I was 4 or 5. And he looked at me and he said, yontif shmontif. So he wrote a poem. He was at that point, 1957, in some kind of a terrible depression, heartbreaking. And I think it was his passion and his sincerity and his love for all things Jewish, Yiddish, Hebrew, Zionism, Jewish socialism, and the fact that it didn't take root, that he didn't have a following in Montreal, which he so richly deserved. He said that it was poetry that made him and poetry that killed him. And as for Jewish faith, that he lost quite early on. Already in his first volume of poetry, there's a magnificent poem that is devoted to Spinoza called Out of the Pulver and the Polished Lens. One of his 2 greatest poems. The other one is The Poet as Landscape. But we're not going to talk about them. We're going to go right to the rocking chair now. The rocking chair is a collection of poetry that's about Quebec culture, about the Quebec people, the Amcha, the simple people. It's not about literary Quebec. And I don't think there was much that impressed Klein at that early period in literary Quebec. There was no Gilles Vignon, there were no great chanteurs, there was no Charles Blanc, there wasn't much. But Klein was enthralled with the life of the Amcha, of the simple Quebecois folk, and he clearly identified very strongly. He walked into that, as Zalek Polak said, he entered into writing the poems in the rocking chair with his Jewish passport, fully comfortable in his Jewishness, and yet fully identifying with the French Canadians and seeing so many parallels between them and their struggle for national self-assertion and Zionism, and there being an oppressed people. Of course, we're not going to be silly, so we don't have to argue. Yes, there was no Holocaust here, but Klein saw their suffering, their subjugation, their humiliation, and he identified very strongly with Quebec. There's only one poem in the entire collection that discusses the rest of Canada, and that's the poem I want to start with. So if we can call up on the screen, Robin, the first poem, The Provinces.
Sorry, the screen share isn't working at this moment, but we'll keep trying to get it.
Well, I know that a lot of you did get it. So I'll just read, and if we get it up on the screen, if you got the PDF, which was sent out to everyone who registered and managed to print it out, I'm going to begin on line 29, not at the beginning. The first 28 lines describe the 9 provinces, right? And it's a very cute description, but it's not a particularly flattering description. You know, biceps and chests, biceps, chests, scooping fish from a river, bashing a forest bald, spitting a country to crop, exercising their poor breakfast. In other words, he describes the Gentiles of English Canada as what we would call in Yiddish boulevans, big, sturdy, heavy, very white people. And then he says, 9, and I'll quote, 9 of them, not counting the adopted boy of the Golden Complex and the proud collateral albino. He's referring to the Yukon and Northwest Territories. Klein believed that they deserved provincial status. He was a champion of native rights way before it was even a thing, a political issue. And so the proud collateral albino refers to the Yukon, and and the adopted boy of the Golden Complex to the Northwest Territories. And then he says in line 34, and this is the key, but the heart seeks one, the heart and also the mind seeks single, the thing that makes them one, if they are one. Yet where can one find it? In their history, he's talking about the 9 provinces, other than 8 provinces other than Quebec, the cairn of their cannonball in the public square, their talk, their jealous double talk, the whim and weather of a geography curling in drift above the 49th, in other words, winter, cold weather. Is this what makes a nation? Or in the alleged repute of character as romantic as Mounties, in other words, this business about Canadians just being so nice and decent and polite, which endures to this day. Of course, we all know it's not that simple. Or discover it perhaps in beliefs, for example, that this is a country of winter Christmas trees. Or hear it from the house with towers, and he goes on and on. He says, line 49, where shall one find it? What can we even name it, that which is sought? He's talking about Canadian national identity, and he's trying to get at its essence, but he doesn't. And I detect a degree of disdain in this poem, although there are debates about that. But he ends by saying, the ladder these 9 brothers hold by rungs, just holding the rungs of a ladder, each on their own rung. The birds that shine on each other, the white water that foams from the ivory entering their eaves, all question marks. Or find it in commonplace, but effective, valid, real, the unity, in the family feature, the not unsimilar face. So that's the ending of the poem. The not, and he says, well, the only thing that Canadians all have in common is what he calls the not unsimilar face, not even the similar face, the not unsimilar face, a vague resemblance. Canadians are white. They're not well tanned because of the winters, whatever it is, they're big and tough. And so there's been a lot of misunderstanding and debate about what Klein really was after here. An early critic of Klein, literary critic of Klein, Miriam Waddington, I think, got it completely wrong. She said that this was Klein's proud assertion of Canadian national identity, but it ends with a question mark. And again, that term, not unfamiliar face, question mark, that's the answer to the question of what binds Canadians together. What is Canadian culture, Anglo-Canadian culture? What is Canadian identity? Zelig Pollock writes about this. There is something almost heroic about the poet's attempt to create a community through an act of imaginative sympathy, but there's something facile about it as well. Well, I have great respect for Zelig Pollock's work. I think he's a brilliant literary analyst, and I'm not a literature person, but I think he's missing the point here. This was not a heroic attempt to assert a positive Canadian identity. It couldn't be, in the way it's expressed in all the question marks and that final line, ending not with an answer, but with a question. What Pollock misses is, I think, a deliberate satirical thrust of the provinces. The poem, at the end of the day, is in my reading, dismissive of any particularly meaningful historical, cultural, ethnic, or personal attributes that truly bind Canadians as sharing any real common national identity. The not unfamiliarity of their faces. Klein, in a letter, used a Yiddish term in an unpublished letter where he says, I was referring to their goyish penim, their goyish faces. That's not a powerful, that doesn't suggest to me that Klein identified strongly with the rest of Canada. Of course, he was a Canadian, and he was proud to be born in Canada. The idea of separatism didn't exist, but his identification was much more powerful, his identification with minorities, the native people. And that brings me to the second poem. I'm just going to quote briefly from it. The second poem is called Indian Reservation Caughnawaga. If you got the handout, unfortunately, we're not able to display it on the screen, so I'll just read a selection from this poem. This is a poem about Caughnawaga. It's pronounced differently today, as everything seems to be, but Indian Reservation Caughnawaga. What happened to the brave, beautiful faces like autumn fruit who stared at the child from the colored frontispiece and the monosyllabic chief who spoke with his throat. Where are these tribes, the feathered bestiaries? With what strange moccasin stealth that scene has changed, with French names, without paint, in overalls, they're bronze. He's talking about the native Canadians in Quebec who have been stripped by Canada of their own identity, and even their appearance has been changed. He writes, their French names, I continue, without paint and overalls, they're bronze like their nobility, expunged. The men, their past is sold as a tchotchke in a shop. Trophies, scalpings for a traveler's dead. Sometimes it's true they will dance for you for a bribe, after a deal done, a bedraggled feather, and welcome a white mayor to speak to the tribe. The animals too are pale. The shine of their fur is lost. Bleached are their living bones. About them watched as through a mist a pious, prosperous ghost. The poem is, of course, and I stop there, bleached are their living bones. This poem is the antithesis of a celebration of not unsimilar faces, but a sad dirge of about the erasure, almost a eulogy for the erasure of the clear similarity, distinctiveness of native Canadian, the First Nations, as we call them, Indians, Eskimos back then. Klein mourns not only the whitening of their own men and their deracination and I won't, it's considered a sexist term, so I won't mention it, but their loss of manhood. But he also even says their animals have become white down to the bleaching of their bones. This is very powerful. Now, in contrast to Klein's disinterest in the bland, white, not unsimilar visages that for him constituted the sole common ground for Canadians, Klein was deeply fascinated with Quebec history, society, culture, and politics, as reflected in all the other poems of this collection, The Rocking Chair. This is not a place for a detailed analysis, and there's no time for it, nor is literary criticism my academic expertise. So I'm looking at this personally as someone who grew up in Quebec as a Jew, who I found out shares, when I read Klein, everything he writes speaks to me, everything. Even his letters, his translations, his editorials, it's as if, I remember when I started reading Klein, this was after I'd left the Shar Shemaim and I was at YIVO as the director of research, and I started reading Klein, and I remember thinking, where have you been my whole life? I found a poetic voice in him, and I'm not a lyrical person. I can't write poetry. So what distinguishes The Rocking Chair from his earlier collections is the absence of any overt Jewish themes. His biographers have all suggested he was spent, he was done with the Jews, but he still needed a passion for people was still there. And so he turned to his neighbors, the Quebecois. And I want to look at, without commentary, because they're self-evident, poem number 6 and poem number 5, a little out of order because of the limitation of time. So poem number 6 is called The Cripples, and it is subtitled Oratoire Saint-Joseph. So we all know, the Montrealers among us know about the cripples who, and by the way, of course, you can't say cripples anymore, but that's the title of the poem. And Jesus in the King James version of the Bible heals the cripples. He doesn't heal the physically challenged. That wouldn't work for a fine translation. So we all know, we've seen it. I think most Montrealers of a certain age have seen the people who are physically disabled or physically challenged going up those stairs on their knees and abandoning their prosthetics and their crutches and their wheelchairs. And here's Klein's poem about that and his admiration for them. Bundled their bones upon the 99 stairs, St. Joseph's ladder, the knobs of penance come, the folded cripples counting up their prayers. How rich, how plump with blessing is that dome, the gourd of Frere Andre, St. Joseph's oratory, of course. His sweet days, rounded, fulfilled, honey to honeycomb. Wither the heads upon the 99 trays, the palsied, who double their aspen selves, the lame, the unsymmetrical, the dead limbed, all raise their look, their hope, and the idée fixe of their main, knowing the surgery is in the soul, or in the heart in one version, surgery is in the soul, are not the ransom crutches worshippers. They know that suddenly their cares and orthopedics will fall from them, and they stand whole again. Roll empty away wheelchairs and crutches without armpits, hop away. And I, who in my own faith once had faith like theirs, but have not now, I am far more crippled than they. And so this is sad. I mean, he's talking about his alienation from Judaism as a religion, which was not merely theological. Yes, he was a rationalist and a Spinozist on some level, but he loved the Jewish tradition. He reviewed Sidurim and Mishnayos. He reviewed Mordechai Kaplan's, a brilliant review of Mordechai Kaplan's Sabbath, the first Reconstructionist Shabbat prayer sitter by Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. And so that is, these poems speak from themselves. Klein harbored an enduringly warm and sentimental childhood affection for the institutions of the Catholic Church, even as he identified strongly with the progressive leftist political forces of change that would liberate the Quebecois masses from the medievalism led by that very church. So there is a real tension here between admiration for the faith of others and tremendous respect, and at the same time, a desire to free the Quebecois masses so that they can assert a secular national identity like the Zionist one. Excuse me. I'm going to read one more poem that illustrate this love of French Catholic Quebec, even though Klein was a complete secularist. It's called For the Sisters of Hotel Dieu. It's poem number 5 in the handout that you, I think, got via email, and you can hopefully you can print them out and look at it after the lecture. I'll read it. For the Sisters of Hotel Dieu, we all know the hospital, in pairs, as if to illustrate their sisterhood, the sisters pace the hospital's garden walks in their robes, black and white, immaculate hoods. They are like birds, the safe domestic fowl of the house of God. Oh, biblic birds, who fluttered to me in my childhood illnesses, me, little, afraid, ill, not of your race, the cool wing for my fever, the hovering solace, the sense of angels, be thanked, oh, plumage of paradise, be praised. He's talking about the gray nuns, not the Jews' best friends, and he's talking about them in this passionate love, which speaks for itself. I'm not going to comment on that further because I just want to get to refer to 2 more poems before my time is up, which is very soon. I want to make clear that Klein was not naive about anti-Semitism in Quebec, hardly. He wrote hundreds of editorials and gave dozens of public speeches denouncing the fascists, the anti-Semites, the anti-conscriptionists. He had a particular hatred of Adrien Arcand, the founder of the Nazi, neo-Nazi Quebecois founder of the Bloc Populaire. And he wrote this poem, Hormisdas Arcand, about Adrien Arcand, the Quebec fascist. Hormisdas Arcand, about to found a new party, manufactures him historic manifesto. Alas, he cannot get beyond the principal first blast. It keeps repeating itself like a Yupin meal. Et pour vrai dire, what more political is there to say once you have said, abat les maudits juifs? And so in his poetry too, Klein very powerfully condemned. He was not naive at all about the anti-Semitism that took root in Quebec. But in his editorials, in his essays, and in his poetry, he insists that it was not unique to Quebec. It wasn't any worse in Quebec than in the rest of Canada. It was just more overt. And he was furious in particular with his friend, Mayor Camillien Hood. The 2 of them had a real friendship. But he wrote a very damning poem about Hood called Political Meeting. I'm not going to have time to read it all, but I will just read two passages and then wrap up. Worship and love their favorite visitor. This is Camillian Hood, a real populist, brilliant politician, and knew how to manipulate the emotions of the masses, and a real character, and also who spent some time in what we call cheder for fighting conscription during World War II. He is their idol, like themselves, not handsome, not snobbish, not of the grand ballet, and intimate, informal. He makes bears compliments. He is tearful. He praises the virtue of being Canadien, Québécois, Canadien, of being at peace, of faith, of family, and suddenly his other ugly voice, where are our sons? He is tearful, your sons. He is tearful, choking tears, but not he would blame the clever English. In their place, he'd do the same, send them off to war. By the way, as an aside, it was Camillian Hood who called the Second World War la guerre anglaise pour les Juifs. He's tearful, and he ends, where are your sons? The whole street now wears one face, shadowed and grim, and in the darkness rises the body odor of race. And so even though he had a real friendship with Camillian Hood, what he could not forgive Camillian Hood for was creating this notion that Quebecers are, by definition, racist. He wrote an editorial, which there's no time to read, called Little Red Riding Hood, which was about a speech that Hood gave at the YMCA on Stanley Street, in which he asserted that French Canadians are, by essence and nature, I'll just read this, delivered himself of a masterpiece in nursery fiction, about the nature and essence of French Canadian blood, and his fairy tale was grim. For like the little girl in the childhood book, Camillian addressed himself to the creature of his creation and says, oh, my grandmother, what wonderful blood pressure you have. Then tranquilly, the mayor replies, the better to fascist you, my dear. There, says the first magistrate, there is the legal proof that the French Canadians are fascist by blood, and if not by name, and by name. And Klein is furious with this, is precisely because here, as the editorial goes on, and I'm concluding right now, JJ, he makes a passionate argument for the fact that it is a very small minority in his own experience growing up in a French part of town, and with all of his political connections with CCF, through the CCF, with French Canadian political leaders. Klein, at the end of the day, detested Hood for tainting the French Canadians with this notion that they are racist and fascist. They are not, insisted. Finally, the politician Klein revered most was Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the first French Canadian prime minister of his country. In editorials and essays, he heaps lavish praise on Laurier, whose conception of Canadian unity was of a very loose confederation, allowing significant legislative authority to its provinces. He was also, Laurier was, a tireless advocate for the interests of his native Quebec, and most importantly, his successful opposition to Canadian conscription during the First World War, not the Second, the First World War. And so this was Klein's model of the finest of Quebecois politicians. A Canadian, someone who does not want to separate from Canada, and yet someone who is insistent on asserting what many, many years later, after Meech Lake became known as special status for Canadians. I think Klein was a bit of a prophet of what ultimately happened in this province and continues to happen, first with the language laws and then with laws, which I think are good laws, insisting on public secularism in the public sector, a religiously neutral society, which ultimately I think is always best for the Jews. And on that editorial comment, we're not going to get to read his greatest poem about Montreal, but you have it. And if you haven't gotten it, Shar will send it to you. And that's his poem Montreal, which is a completely bilingual poem. He goes back and forth from French to English, has only to do with words. And but we don't have time for that. And so I'll end by saying that A.M. Klein was exactly the kind of Canadian and Quebecois and Jew that I am. And that's why, of all the topics I could have chosen, I really wanted to share with you my real love and passion for this this incredible genius, sadly neglected by our community and by Canada more generally. I mean, he got his first literary prize in Canada was for The Rocking Chair, which is Quebecois, and it was the Governor General's Prize that he got. He did get that for this last published volume of poems, and there's a tremendous irony in that he had to write a poem about Quebec and disdainful of English Canada to get the Governor General of Canada's literary prize. Thank you very much.
We do have a question from Gideon Pollock. Rabbi Nadler, can you elaborate on what Klein's contemporaries in the Montreal Jewish community thought of him? I grew up with my father always telling me proudly how Klein was his teacher at Talmud Torah, but you yourself said that he was much more popular in the United States and that you had never read anything of his until you were an adult.
I knew about Klein because my father talked gloriously about it. My father was also his insurance broker. He had his life insurance policy, as well as his friend David Lewis's. So, I grew up hearing about Klein, but as this kind of mythological figure, the great A.M. Klein, my father used to say. My father read Klein, but I went to the Adath Israel School. Klein wasn't on the curriculum. We were reading, Hugh McLennan's Two Solitudes, and we were reading inferior Canadian literature. No apology to Hugh McLennan. It's a mediocre book, but we had to read it. Gideon, that's a great question. I will say that as I began the lecture, within a very small circle of writers and poets, he had a huge influence. And I want to name three of the people who would have never become the poets and the writers they were Klein not their teacher, literally their teacher. Leonard Cohen, who actually wrote a song and recorded a song called For My Teacher, which was a very sad song about Klein's retreat and silence in the last decades of his life. Irving Layton, who was profoundly influenced by Klein's Holocaust poetry, but Layton stayed angry. Klein abandoned his anger. The fury of Klein was absorbed and took over the work of Irving Layton, great poet, and of course Mordechai Richler. That's significant. He was their teacher, and it's clear that they knew that they owed a huge debt of gratitude to him. And of course, but the truth is, Gideon, that the words of his that had the greatest impact were the words he wrote for Samuel Bromfield. And that wasn't him. He was writing for the Shar HaShamayim, and that wasn't Klein's world, and so that's a sad irony. I mean, although he wrote wonderful speeches, and Bromfield stood for all that was good and right and charitable in the Montreal Jewish community, for Israel, for Zionism, for every imaginable Jewish cause. And so in that sense, Klein had a huge influence, because Bromfield's speeches, when Sam Bromfield gave a speech, there was a big audience. When Klein would give a poetry reading, there would be 20 people. But, Bromfield was the most powerful and prestigious and influential Jew in Canada, I think we can say. And Klein was his muse.
Rabbi, some thought that when your name appeared on the marquee as speaking for Tuesday Night Learning at Shar Shamayim, that we would be hearing about Spinoza or about some insight into modern Hasidic commentary and thought. What motivated you tonight to speak about A.M. Klein?
Well, first of all, I'm tired about speaking about my areas of academic interest and expertise, but mostly it was because I want to thank Louis Dobrin, because I contacted him with a suggestion that we invite Goldie Morgenthaler to talk about her book about her mother's poems, Yiddish poetry, and then he asked me, well, Rabbi Nadler, perhaps you want to give a lecture, and I had just moved back to Montreal. And everything, all of my American colleagues at the university, at Drew and at Evo, they all said, "You're nuts, you're crazy. No one, Jews," actually, the professor of Christian theology at Drew University and the chairman at the time of the comparative religion department, and a good friend of mine, a theologian named Darrell Cole, said, "I was led to believe that there is a theological obligation, a religious obligation upon rabbis that when they retire, it's either Jerusalem or Miami, not Montreal." And everyone said, "Why are you going back to Montreal?" And I couldn't explain it. I just love this place. It's in the bones. It's bred in the bones. It's something that's not shared by my siblings or my 24 cousins, none of whom are still in Montreal. There's part of that exodus. So I was under, I was happy to be home. I was miserable about the winter, but still very happy to be in Montreal, feeling at home. And it just, when Klein writes about Quebec as a Jew, coming as a Jew, a fully proud and learned Jew to Quebec, I know of no other writer. I mean, Bialik was a great Hebrew writer, but he didn't write with love for the Russian Pale of Settlement. Chaim Grada, the other alter ego, who Klein influenced, by the way. Chaim Grada was my teacher. He never wrote nicely and beautifully and lovingly about Catholic nuns in Lithuania, or superstitious cripples walking upstairs and thinking, no, he thought they were fools and peasants and anti-Semites. Klein somehow managed to navigate the anti-Semitism by marginalizing it. And what never left him was this love. And it can't be explained or rationalized, this sense that this is an amazing place. It's unique. It's remarkable. It's chauvinistic to say, and I'm a little uncomfortable saying it, but for me, it's the best place in the world. Tied with Tel Aviv, but so it just came to me, and I have to thank Louis because it was in the context of Goldie Morgencolor, another Montrealer who's now somewhere in Saskatchewan. That we were going to fly her to Montreal to give a talk. Maybe that will be possible in a few months. And then he asked me for a topic, and I just blurted out A.M. Klein because I was actually reading Klein at the time to make sense of my decision to come back home. So thanks for that question.
We have a couple more questions. Guigui Biton writes, "I read that Klein dealt with the Shoah by adopting a Kabbalistic approach. However, do you believe that ultimately Klein lost his faith?"
Oh, Klein definitely lost his faith. There's no question. He was not Orthodox. He was not observant. He was not he was not a believer. I mean, it's not, you will always find people who say about all the great thinkers and writers who are somewhat unconventional or even deemed heretical, from Maimonides to Spinoza to Chaim Grada to Moses Mendelssohn, in the frum world, in the stringently Orthodox world, maybe the Haredi, but the seriously frum world, let's say the Black Hat and Hasidic world, there are always stories and tales of the return to faith, the mystical, at the end of their lives. They all became Balei Tshuva, all the great secular Yiddish writers. And I'm not making this up. I mean, I've written about this. I mean, in the case of Chaim Grada, it was nonsense. Chaim Grada was an ardent secularist, but a great scholar of Talmud, one of the greatest scholars of Talmud, a student of the Chazon Ish. And Grada actually told me, "You're from Montreal." That's where A.M. Klein, the greatest, he said, the beste English or Yiddish dichter in the Geschichte, the greatest Anglo-Jewish writer in the history of modern Jewish literature, A.M. Klein, and I knew nothing about him, and I was embarrassed. But no, the Kabbalistic thing, yeah, there is something to that. You're probably thinking of the glosses, the mystical glosses to the second scroll. The second scroll is based on the books of the Bible, but modernized and secularized to follow the second redemption, not from Egypt, the redemption from Europe and the creation of the state of Israel. Klein wrote that after his 1949 visit to the state of Israel, which moved him powerfully. And he wrote this very powerful second account of the liberation of the Jews from their tsaras. And in the back, there are these glosses. Some are Kabbalistic, The longest gloss is about Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel. So he didn't become a Roman Catholic. He wrote beautifully and admiringly of the Sistine Chapel. He wrote beautifully of the Arabs of Casablanca. He was traveling the world looking for this mythical Uncle Melech, and he never found him. He ended up dying in Israel. And so there are some Kabbalistic glosses, and in his earliest volume of poetry, there's the portrait of the Minion. I mean, this is a whole other lecture. He wrote very lovingly about Shul. He wrote Portrait of a Minion, with things about the cantor, the rabbi. They're all a little mocking, but they also show that, there's another thing about Klein that I relate to. He loved Shul. He used to go to Shul simply not to daven or to talk to God. He liked to be with his people. And Shul, what's not to love about Shul? Especially if you have a great chazan, as we do, greatest. So, and the greatest choir. So there's a little Shar Shemaim chauvinism, but it's true. And so, yes, he dabbled in Kabbalah. In his first volume, Hath Not a Jew, there are poems like about the Baal Shem Tov, but they're not really about the Baal Shem Tov. But all of this is kind of is nostalgia. It doesn't indicate that Klein himself became a chassid, that he wrote a poem called the Baal Shem Tov or the Don LeGaon. It meant that these people were important to him. And I mentioned already, he reviewed commentary on a Mishnah by Petrushka. He reviewed Talmudic works, Sidurim. He was deeply interested in religious literature. And he had, as with the French Canadians, he had this respect for people of faith. But in the case of the Jews, because of his terrible, deep personal disappointment, his anguish with not having been recognized and heeded as a prophetic poet, I think he was more bitter towards religious Jews. And a lot of his unpublished material, there's a volume of two unpublished novels. And by the way, if you have time, we can go through, this is some of my Klein books. I prepared them for you, but I don't have time to read them all. But there are some very, very powerful letters, some of them published in a volume called Notebook, Selections from the A.M. Klein Papers. The archives are in the National Library of Canada and the University of Toronto, two places, and there are hundreds and hundreds of unpublished letters. I spent many hours in Ottawa going through these papers and in Toronto, and it's clear that he was not a man of faith. He was
the questions are coming in, but Rabbi, we are at our limit time-wise, so perhaps we will have to do a part two at some stage.
We'll figure out a way. I'm very happy to engage people with questions. It's maybe when we're all vaccinated and indoors, we can find a corner in Landy Hall after davening at the Shar, and people can come and ask their questions, and we'll have a little table, a little discussion. And by the way, if you didn't get the poems, I think I'm going to suggest that Shar Cares, that Jonathan is connected with that program, he's well connected there, that Shar Cares, along with the beautiful Friday night and Shabbos meals that they deliver to people every Friday, which is an amazing, beautiful thing. Kudos to Rabbi Shire, who has brilliantly managed this thing, orchestrated it. It's a tremendous tribute to the Shar and to its rabbi. So I think maybe the poem should be just dropped in those bags with the Shar Care soup.
Nice idea.
Okay.
We are very privileged this evening to have A.M. Klein's granddaughter with us. So I'd like to call upon Professor Allan Klein to thank our guest speaker.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that gracious introduction. Professor Nadler, it was such a pleasure to listen to your erudite and intimate talk, Juif du Pays, A.M. Klein's poetic love for Quebec. Love of community, however complicated, was a theme running through my grandfather's work. And I thank you for taking us so masterfully through how, in your words, my grandfather extended his instinctive affections for his ancestral people to his parents' adopted land. I also appreciated how you brought out his biting wit, sometimes dark wit, and his humor. As a born and bred Quebecois, connection to this province is, of course, something deep and personal for you, as it was for A.M. Klein, bringing you back to live, which is what brought you back to live here, even after 30 years away. Now, despite your protestations, it's clear from your talk how well placed you are to discuss my grandfather's work from a scholarly perspective as well, not just from the personal perspective. And I know you're going to argue with me.
As a reader.
You're
Not a scholar.
But like my grandfather, you have spent your career navigating intellectual, spiritual, and political aspects of what it means to be Jewish in a contemporary cosmopolitan world in the aftermath and then the later extended aftermath of the Holocaust, and particularly here in Quebec. Now, as it happens, as I was preparing for this evening, I learned that you studied with Montreal's former chief rabbi, Pinchas Hirschsprung, Zichrono Livracha, for 5 years. You may know that my grandfather and Rabbi Hirschsprung knew each other quite well. They were neighbors on Curbs, which that's yeah. Right, with Shauna Van Praag had mentioned in some of the questions, my colleague.
I studied in Rabbi Hirschsprung's home, right, very close to A.M. Klein's home.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And Rabbi Hirschsprung also presided over my grandfather's funeral. Now, in his 1942 essay in the Canadian Jewish Chronicle, my grandfather, which we were talking about right before, my grandfather writes about meeting a 27-year-old Rabbi Hirschsprung, and the two were actually about the same age. And my grandfather describes Rabbi Hirschsprung's phenomenal knowledge of Talmud to the point where he could recite word for word the entire text and Tosafot of any page of the Talmud at the mere prompting of a page number. Having studied with the chief rabbi, you, Rabbi Nadler, are probably in a better position, and I'll call you Rabbi Nadler when talking in this way, to confirm my grandfather's account. In any event, the relationship, maybe not. In any event, the relationship between Rabbi Hirschsprung and my grandfather was one of genuine intellectual and personal respect, despite many obvious differences, most notably, as you remarked, when it comes to matters of faith and belief. Now, although your work as a rabbi and a scholar has understandably focused on loving and thinking about Jewish community, like my grandfather's earlier work, I was so pleased that for this talk, at this time, in this congregation, you chose to celebrate my grandfather's love of Quebec. This is the work for which he received much acclaim. The Rocking Chair and Other Poems has been called his best poetic achievement. I'm in no position myself to judge whether that is true, but I can say that the focus on Quebec in his later work has been profoundly significant for me personally. In an introductory letter to the Rocking Chair and Other Poems, which no doubt you've read, my grandfather explained that he chose to, quote, look upon the French Canadian, end quote, because of common, quote, minority position, ancient memories, and the desire for group survival. Scholars have described his portrait of the province as a remarkable act, and you referenced this in your talk, of empathy. Many of his poems were more of, maybe it's possible that his poems were more of a projection of his own culture. And it has been argued, and I'll leave that to the academics, to the scholars in this area, that these were more a projection of his own culture than a concentrated effort to understand Quebec culture per se. And I confess that I have wondered what to make of the fact that Montreal, a poem that you referenced, in an invented kind of Gallicized language, and this is the one that begins, O City Metropole, Isle Riveraine, is really primarily, even though you described it as bilingual, it's really primarily an English language poem with some invented words. We can debate it.
We're gonna we're gonna meet over coffee one day about that. No,
we will. But I've read some scholars say that, and the reason why I found that interesting and why I actually liked it is because it helped me to understand that a project about identification, which is really what this project was about, would naturally be from his personal and individual perspective. And so what I loved about this later project that you've chosen to highlight is that because it's about identification, about humanism, about our obligation to connect with others in our polity, not just superficially, but in sensory detail, because of that, I feel that I cannot imagine a message that's more important in this particular time and place that we're living in. As we're fighting, of course, a global pandemic that keeps us not having this conversation in person as I'd like to be, as we're reckoning with police violence along racial lines and increasing threats of racism, which was a central theme in his work, and as our political structures and populism threaten to divide us more than they give us an opportunity to get to know each other. and to understand each other. I thank you, Professor Nadler, for highlighting this particular legacy of my grandfather's work at this particular time so that we can continue to draw on it when we really need it. I'd like to conclude with your indulgence, because I know I'm also over time, by acknowledging again, as I think of our ancestors, and as we think about carrying our ancestors' lessons forward with us, that Bert Gilman is not here with us tonight. He was a dear friend of mine, a father of my very, very dear friend, the father of my very dear friend, Eric Gilman, a lover of poetry, of Yiddishkeit, of Quebec and Canada. He died 3 weeks before this event, which wouldn't have happened without him. And it is such a shame. I cannot imagine anything in this world that he would have enjoyed more than this night, and my heart is heavy for his absence. Rabbi Nadler, you've honored him so beautifully with this talk, and for that also, I thank you.
Wow, I'm honored. Thank you. That was beautiful.